This presentation is brought to you by the SDG Decision Education Center.
Hello, and welcome to the 7 Deadly Sins of Strategy, Part 2, brought to you by SDG Decision Education Center and Texas Executive Education at the University of Texas. I'm Lynn Slattery, Director at Texas Executive Education and manager of a portfolio of open enrollment programs designed for busy professionals. This portfolio includes the Strategic Decision and Risk Management Certificate program, which brings together the academic research and practical application teaching of UT faculty and 35 years of experience in strategy consulting and decision education of SDG, and serves as the basis for this webinar series. We are proud to be partnering with SDG on this series of programs. If you've missed any of our previous webinars on decision quality, negotiation, game theory, and several others, please check out the recorded version on the SDG website shown in the gray box of this slide. And while you're there, you'll also want to register for our next webinar, Strategic Innovation, the Power of Design Thinking in Business, coming up on December 6th. Today I'm excited to have two experts in decision-making under conditions of uncertainty and complexity, Karl Spetzler and Mazen Skaff, back with us to discuss how behaviors that are considered sins at one moment are lauded as virtues when applied at another time or in a different situation. Karl has been helping top business leaders for over 40 years to create innovative new strategies that deal with the complexities of uncertainty and risk over long time horizons. CEO and chairman of Strategic Decisions Group, Karl is the lead author of Decision Quality, Value Creation from Better Business Decisions. Mazen Skaff is a partner and managing director at Strategic Decisions Group. He has extensive experience in strategy, corporate development, and financial risk management. He has advised clients in a variety of industries, including technology and communications, energy, biotechnology, and pharmaceuticals. In addition to his consulting practice, he is an instructor and delivers courses and seminars in decision analysis, decision quality, corporate strategy, and risk management. Karl, I'll turn the floor over to you to begin.
Thank you, Lynn. It's my pleasure. And first, let's just kind of look back at some of the deadliest sins. Here are the votes that we got out of our part 1 on the deadliest sins. And we have grouped them by the combination of totally deadly and quite deadly. So the percentages refer to those two categories of your votes. And so delusion is the top one. Pride, groupthink, indolence, incognizance, dissociation, and wimpiness make up our top 7. We chose 7 because there were 7 deadly sins in general, but note that operationalism and simplism are very close, and I would suggest that when you think about deadly sins, think about them in the context of your own organization, and it may be a different 7 than the ones up here. We've also had some wonderful suggestions in response to our last webinar from some of the audience, things like short-termism. I would probably include that in operationalism, by the way. I think most of the operationalism has a very short-term orientation and bias for action and so on. So let's go through each of the top 7 and just think for a moment about what the opposing virtue would be. Number 1, delusion, which was crafting strategy without grounding any way in reality. The number 1 thing we want to do here is to really ground ourselves in external validated data. And external, it usually requires an outside-in view. And most of the people from within the organization are naturally, because of where they're spending their time and putting their attention, find themselves with an inside-out view as opposed to an outside-in view. In addition to that, I think the opposing virtue for delusion and overcoming it is to insist on actionable alternatives. And these alternatives, to be actionable, have to be supported by real resources, commitment. So it's not like you come up with a strategy and you agree on the strategy and now you have to go for budget. You know, the budget allocation or the resource allocation has to be part of a definition of an actionable strategy, and thereby you can get true commitment to action. And resource commitments usually come both as money and people, the right people that are committed to this, and not afterwards saying, you know, we just couldn't spare the people to get the strategy done. The next one was pride, kind of overconfidence and arrogance and a strong belief that we are the best and therefore a disdain of competitors and things of that sort. The primary opposing virtue is a culture of humility and a kind of a learning frame, openness to learning, and generally respecting that others might actually come up with the winning idea. And the let's say the extreme version of this is the humility that comes with the paranoia that people talked about. Only, you know, the founder of Intel, his point was only the paranoid survive in this rapid change and constantly us coming up with better business models and taking businesses out and new. Okay, so the third one was groupthink, desire for conformity that results in irrational and dysfunctional decisions. And this conformity is a huge pressure. In the extreme, it becomes lynch mobs. Okay? Humans want to work together and become aligned through that process. What can you do about it? Well, you seek and build diversity into the teams. You recognize and avoid the social biases that bring this conformance and substitute agreement for true decision quality. This is a universal behavior where in most organizations, if we agree in the room, it must be the right decision. That assumption you have to kind of puncture. And then the culture and processes that you can institute to really use diverse opinions and dissent can be built into the facilitation of groups. Groups can be, if facilitated correctly, a big advantage. If poorly facilitated, they actually come to this group think, and you do have to put a counter pressure in to make it work. Next is indolence. And this was kind of not following through and inactivity and procrastination. What you have to do is insist on true commitment to action for strategic decisions. A decision is not just a report. A decision is not just knowing what to do. It is actually complete connection to the action so that it can happen. Number 5, incognizance. That's not knowing, and often not even knowing that we don't know. That's the most dangerous version of that. And what you do with that is often reach out and select the right people that often have a bigger perspective. You look for the big thinkers. You foster a culture that refreshes the strategic perspective in all of this, and you stay in this humility learning frame. The learning frame is an assumption that I don't know. So I am really curious about what I'm hearing and what I'm saying. So what others are saying. So through that, you can overcome a lot of this. Number 6 was dissociation. That was the state of separation and disunion and all the stovepipes in organizations and functional separation, and especially that become professional interest groups. So how do you overcome that? Well, number 1, seek the conflict and bring it into the team. Have conflict and think of it as fuel in the early stages before you make a decision. Where conflict gets in the way of action, conflict, if it doesn't turn into name calling, actually is an advantage in terms of really opening our thinking, and you don't have to be afraid of this dissociation or another business unit or another function having a different and conflicting perspective. You can overcome a lot of that by then involving the right people at the right time. And that brings us to the last one, which was wimpiness. And wimpiness is this, we take bland, incremental, overly risk-averse alternatives. And what we need to do is think about rewards, have a culture of thinking big, and insist on alternatives when you make a decision that go from we call mild to wild. Okay, so be sure that you include a wide range of alternatives so that you overcome that. If you have all that, you would have overcome the deadliest sins. Now, in fact, when you really tackle this, you find that the sins don't exist in isolation. They feed each other, and they manifest in different ways throughout an organization. And what we find is that how we make strategic decisions is really at the center of most of these sins. Okay, and it's at the center in the way that it defines how we need to respond and where how we address it. And that brings us to the question, so how do we become more virtuous? And let me turn it over to Mazen to start that conversation.
Thanks, Carl. Let's turn now to how organizations can become more virtuous. To become more virtuous, organizations must act at three distinct levels: the values, the culture, and the day-to-day behaviors, processes, and tools that they use. It is important that there is alignment across these levels to enable virtuous behavior and to avoid strategy sins. And we'll talk about, when they're not aligned, what it means for an organization. Let's start with values. Values are the foundational core. They define what is true north for the organization and guide behaviors and decision-making at a fundamental level. A strong set of values that are both espoused and practiced by the organization can promote virtuous behaviors and help avoid strategy failures. For example, if I look at one of my clients, a very successful consumer goods multinational, they emphasized and practiced the value of humility and the pursuit of learning and apprenticeship among their values. This helped shape the culture and proved effective to fend off the sin of pride, which is often described as the root cause of all other sins, as we saw in the material from last webinar and what Carl summarized earlier in the webinar today. It is important to make a distinction between what an organization declares as its espoused values and what it practices. If we turn to culture, culture is the embodiment of the values in the habits of an organization, and an organization that has a strong set of values and truly lives these values would have a healthy and resilient culture. A healthy and resilient culture provides a safety net for an organization, and a safety net that is usually not easy to obtain or cannot be attained with either strategy or risk management alone. For example, during one of the fuel price crises that faced the airline industry, Southwest Airlines did not have to make the tough decision of executing a pay cut. Employees volunteered for it, and this is indicative of Southwest's very resilient culture. The level of behaviors, processes, and tools, that's the third level we talked about, and this is the level we observe on a day-to-day basis. These provide the building blocks of decision-making and actions in the working place. This is where sins or virtues manifest or multiply. Decision makers and how we go about decision-making within an organization and how we decide is central to all these three levels. It also provides us with a very powerful lever, as we will discuss further today. And by improving the decision-making process, you can catalyze and effect positive change across the three levels, at the culture level, at the values level, and of course, in the processes and tools. One of our clients, Vince Baraba, put it very succinctly when he said, if you want to change the culture of an organization and you want the change to stick, start by changing the decision-making process. So if we turn to our first poll today, please think of this in the context of your own organization. In our organization, to become more virtuous, we have to improve, and you can choose one of the four responses. Is it our values and culture? Is it our processes and tools? Both? Or is it we're okay in strategy, it's execution where we're hurting? Please take a minute to answer the poll.
It's interesting. We're having an overwhelming response on it's both. 60% of the audience says we have to work on both, and only 8% think in their particular case it's on execution. And Mazen, I think that's because we picked the strategic sense here. You know, it's not just the operational ones.
Correct. And I'm glad we see the response coming mostly, it's both at both levels, and that's also reflective of the experienced audience we have here, because we see the sins manifesting in the outcomes and the decisions and how we go about strategy, but it's indicative that we have issues at multiple levels, and that's very true in many organizations. Shall we continue now with how many organizations, by the way they choose their decision process, they can either get on a virtuous path or a path that encourages or exacerbates the sinning. So many organizations use the advocacy and approval process in decision making, and this exacerbates strategy sins. Under an advocacy process, the decision board would assign a champion or form a team to work on a decision. The champion or the team would go off and work on the decision and come back with a recommendation that they would then advocate and defend in front of the decision board. An advocacy process puts the decision board or the decision maker, if it's a single decision maker, in the awkward position of having to inspect quality in the decision in the final stage or close to the final stage of the decision-making process. And this does not work. At the same time, the assigned champion or the team working on the decision find themselves in the position of having to defend the recommendation and fend off attacks or questions or tough questions from the decision board. All this would be happening without adding much quality to the organization or improving the strategy. Would a team that is advocating a specific strategy come up with a thorough analysis of other alternatives that may be better for the organization? Probably not, under an advocacy process. So advocacy processes encourage sinning, and we often see multiple sins, starting with dissociation, groupthink, simplism and premature, bias for action and indolence. Further, in cases where the assigned champion is the head of a business unit, for example, then under an advocacy process, sometimes other sins come into play, including pride and delusion. There must be a better way to approaching strategic decision-making in organizations. And one of the better ways that has been proven time and again is the dialogue decision process. So the dialogue decision process has been adopted by leading organizations in various sectors, and it's been proven to be effective in promoting virtuous behaviors and in helping to avoid many of the strategy sins. It enables a decision-focused dialogue, as we see here in the figure, between two groups: the decision makers on one side, and these guys have these people have the authority to make the decision, and the project team, and those are the people that have the intimate knowledge of the context of the decision and also are likely to be responsible for implementing the decision or the strategy. As you can see, both teams are engaged upfront and at each key step in the process, from developing the frame for the decision, making sure we are addressing the right decisions, then to generating alternatives that span the strategic scope available to the organization, and making sure to account for the different perspectives and competing alternatives that different people on the decision board, for example, may have in mind. Then moving on to evaluating the alternatives and comparing them to enable a decision and a recommended strategy that oftentimes builds on more than one alternative. There are many variants of the dialogue decision process, or the DDP, as many of our colleagues and many clients we've worked with and industry leaders call it. Some organizations have tailored it to their own industry or specific culture. Essentially, the DDP helps avoid many of the sins, and further, it helps ensure quality decisions. So let's look at some of the sins that we avoid in cognizance, by starting with a full assessment of the situation and involving multiple people with different perspectives. It helps avoid groupthink and wimpiness, especially by encouraging and being very alternatives driven, having alternatives that we consider in the alternative stage, and it's very important to do that, not stick with one single alternative or favored strategy that one specific person came up with and anchored the whole group on. That is indolence. And then other sins that are also avoided are dissociation, by involving all the key parties at each stage of the process, and then delusion and pride, because we're promoting interaction between the decision team and the project team and involving subject matter experts. This helps a lot. And again, by putting in the right decision process, you can slowly but surely positively affect the culture. Let's turn now to the second poll. And if we were to answer, where are you on a scale between the advocacy process and the dialogue decision process within your organization? Please let us know. And please vote on which of the four best describe where you are. And while we wait for the poll, it'll be probably good to address some of the questions that are coming through. One question that came up is, we got the poll results.
Okay. So, and it looks like, Mazen, that we are very early stage for most people. Most organizations still depend on the advocacy process for making strategic decisions.
Yeah, and that's typically where we get involved with a lot of organizations, and going through this webinar and what Carl is going to talk about next will help address some of this. Carl, back to you.
So in terms of the question, and what we really have to do is get the top management to understand that decision quality is what they're going for. And I'm not going to, in this discussion here, redefine decision quality. There's 6 requirements. But I think we're still in many organizations in a situation where decision makers believe that decision making is more of a choice of leadership style. And there are many styles that work, but the end product has to meet the requirements of decision quality. And I think for that reason, let's just ask a last poll here of where are you in your organizations in terms of your leadership understands and demands decision quality. Because until they understand it and demand it, it's very hard to deliver it to them. So please answer in terms of the typical agree-disagree scale, and we are getting the results in, and I think we're all over the map. There are quite a few people that in their organizations they disagree, so that they're still far from this or somewhat disagree. But I'm also pleased to see that there are some organizations where this has taken hold, and people can say, yes, I agree, 14%, and if we add to that the 23 that somewhat agree, that's encouraging. So what we're seeing now is that these 7 sins can be addressed very effectively through thinking about them as at the core as decision-making sins at the strategy level. And I think that the most effective tool or most effective response to avoiding these sins is having the organization become conscious of decision quality at the and make it a value and part of their culture to drive for high-quality decisions that maximize value, and then going through and saying, what does it take to do that? And we have a way that we can teach some of this. And let me turn it over to Lynn.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carl and Mazen, for bringing us your expert insights on these deadly sins of strategy. That was very interesting. As we prepare for Q&A, I did want to share with today's participants how you can take part in more in-depth and expanded programs. So coming up on your screen now, as I mentioned at the beginning, this topic is part of our SDRM program, and you'll see the outline of our upcoming classes as well as website, email address, and so forth for additional information and registration. These classes may be taken individually or combined to earn your SDRM certificate, and the material that was covered in today's webinar, part 2, and the part 1 that you took part in last month is really centered around a lot of the things that they talk about in our Achieving Strategic Decision Quality class. And the next class will be offered on-site in Austin on April 16th through the 18th of 2018. But we also are proud to announce that it will be very shortly available as an online class as well. I know some of you are unable to get into all classes on site, so there will be very shortly an option to do online for this class. So now, as we move into our first question, we do have one more poll that we would appreciate your responses to, and just in regard to your interest in the SDRM series. So while the audience is completing the survey, let's go to our questions. One of the listeners is asking, how do you apply these ideas to a crisis response scenario? And Carl, I'll turn this one over to you to start with.
Well, I think when you're in a crisis mode, it's very hard to think strategically. So the number one answer to that is you have to be prepared. What people do that are in the crisis management world for that reason is they simulate situations and practice and have the chance to think through the alternatives well ahead of time. I recently attended a conference of a group of police chiefs of different cities and FEMA leadership and so on. And one of the participants said, you know, what we have to be ready for is someone yells and says, shooter on floor 14. At that point, the strategic decisions have to be on automatic. And I think that's the number one thing, is to really go through and have that. All the emergency response personnel understand that and are highly trained for that. That's also key for certain military decision-making. There's a whole rapid decision-making world out there that you can look into if you have greater interest in this topic.
Wonderful. We have another question. Another listener is asking about recognizing sins. So assuming your organization recognizes the sins that you're making, can you share some ideas on how to help them sort of get out of their own way to address them? And Mazen, I'll turn this one over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. In terms of that question, it's really embodied in both of the webinars we've covered, and we talked about it more today. A good place to start is the decision-making process. Yes, let's identify the various weaknesses and challenges that an organization may have at the values level, culture, and in the processes. But a very quick way and very effective way to start is at the decision-making process, and this can catalyze change both in the processes themselves and at the cultural level, and then indirectly, eventually, at the values level. And the more we practice this and make the decision-making process virtuous and committing to the resulting outcome from the decision and implementing that, this becomes a habit, and soon enough it starts impacting the culture. And we've talked about that earlier in the webinar. There are some specific interventions at the level of each sin, but you need an integrated approach, and it comes in the decision-making process.
Mazen, let me piggyback on that for just a moment. One of our courses that we offer in this program is on biases, and it really is helpful for people to begin to understand the most common natural biases, some of which are behind the sins. I think understanding decision traps and biases and beginning to build in preventions and repairs in an organization is a big piece of that.
Yes, very much so.
Wonderful, yes. All right, I think we have time. We're going to squeeze in one more question. I'll turn this one over to you, Carl, first. And what we're being asked is, how do you overcome leaders who prefer the groupthink method, and they choose to kind of close out those who want to really help us get to better outcomes?
Well, first let me say groupthink doesn't mean that every group that gets together is in groupthink mode. So groupthink is usually the term used for a dysfunctional group process that leads to agreement in spite of not coming to the best choice. Okay, many organizations want to be very collaborative, and so include many people in the decision making. And I think what you'd like to do is have them understand the dysfunctionality that can happen in groups, and then put in preventions and use the collaboration actually to enhance the quality of decision making, as opposed to falling into an unfacilitated groupthink mode.
Yeah,
I think that's the key.
I would add to that, Carl, that pursue diversity in the organization to make sure we don't fall into groupthink. One good example is how Facebook went out of its comfort zone and hired Sheryl Sandberg to be the COO, and that proved extremely effective in that organization, for example.
Great. Great example. Thank you, Carl Mazen. I also want to say thank you to our participants for spending your time and energy with us today. This is all the time we have for today, so we will answer additional questions offline that we weren't able to get to during this presentation. We look forward to connecting with you again very soon, and please let us know what we can do for you in the meantime. Take care and have a great day.